We live in interesting times. The only certainty seems to be change. Sometimes this is called the intangibles economy, the data-driven economy, the new economy, sometimes no less than a fourth industrial revolution. I will be using these terms interchangeably, even though there are subtle differences, but they all signal the broad trends that I hope to explore in this series and what they mean for policymaking. In the process, I hope we can address questions such as, how much of this is really new? Is it the content of the change, or is it the speed of the change that should be of concern to us? Does the discipline of economics give us the right tools to understand these changes? Do we have the right analytical tools, and do policymakers have the right incentive structures to do what's best for society? Change has never been as rapid as it is currently, and this poses a dilemma for policymakers and for users more broadly. And to put that in some historic context, the Stone Age unfolded over a period of 1.1 million years. Fire, cooking, languages unfolded over several 100,000 years. The so-called agricultural revolution, the domestication of animals, the invention and use of mud bricks, irrigation, kilns, and salting to preserve food unfolded over a period of something like 6,000 years, between 9,000 and 3,000 BC. The Bronze Age, another great advance in human evolution, lasted between 4,000 BC and 1,200 BC. The main inventions that drove especially the early parts of the Industrial Revolution, the telescope in 1608, the steam engine in 1712, the spinning jenny in 1764, and the wind turbine in the late 1800s, all unfolded over a period, therefore, of about 150 years. That is quite different from the way we're now dealing with technological change. The traditional way in which we look at change and development and economic growth goes back to the work of Colin Clark, Simon Kuznets, Hollis Chenery, and Moshe Sirkin. What they do is come up with what may be called uniform patterns that economies exhibit as they go through a process of change and transformation, which is actually remarkably stable across large groups of countries. Economies in their early stages of development have large agriculture and extractive sectors, smaller industrial sectors, and services sectors. And as the economy grows and develops, the agricultural sector as a share of total GDP declines, and the share of industry and services rise. And in fact, services sometimes rise faster than industry does. And so it's not uncommon to associate wealth and level of development with the size of your services sector vis-a-vis the size of your agricultural sector. Now, there are exceptions. My country, Canada, is one. Australia, New Zealand, many of the oil-producing countries have become rich without having this large diminution in their agriculture or extractive sector. It is also the case that the services and manufacturing sectors in some of these countries are geared towards the primary sector or towards agriculture and extraction. But as a broad portrayal of structural change, I think this diagram has it right. Underpinning this same trichotomy is the rise of what may be called intangibles. We can think of intangibles as being in three categories: computerized information, which is mainly software and databases. Second, so-called innovative property. We'd recognize that as R&D, minerals exploration, the creation of entertainment and artistic products, as well as design and other product development costs. And the final category in intangibles is so-called economic competencies. And a way to think of that is firm-level reorganization or firm-level betterment. Training is one example. Market research and branding is another. Business process re-engineering is an important part of this. And what's common in all of these is the presence of one or the other kind of intellectual property. It could be copyright, it could be a patent, it could be some kind of design or brand-based wealth. But at the end of the day, intangibles are driven by intellectual property, which is mostly proprietary, often exclusionary, and this is where wealth now tends to reside. Intangibles cross-cut the traditional Kuznets vision of the economy that we saw previously, but they do so in different ways. In the next few minutes, I'd like to give you an indication of what the size of this intangibles economy is, bearing in mind that we don't have the conventions around the world to measure intangibles the way they should be. We need a global statistical effort of the kind we saw in the 1950s when the UN developed its system of national accounting, which standardized the way countries measure key economic aggregates so that policymakers in those countries and elsewhere, and all of us, have a sense of what the size and composition and dynamics of an economy look like. We're not there yet with intangibles. And so we're looking at bits and pieces here and there until we get that global public good of a universal accounting system for intangibles. But let's begin with this one. This is work that the World Intellectual Property Organization did about 10 years ago, showing you the value composition of the average smartphone. Materials, including the so-called very important critical minerals that drive a lot of digital production, comprise about 22% of the value of a smartphone. The all-important labor comprises 5%. And so when we think of countries specializing in their comparative advantage, especially static comparative advantage, and if we say to them, do what you do best, for many countries, what we're doing is limiting them to about 27% of the value chart. We've put a ceiling on their growth based on their labor attributes and their extractive or minerals attributes, when in fact, the large majority of value and wealth now resides outside those categories. Take a look at the remaining slices in this pie chart. Distribution and retail accounts for something like 15% of the value of a smartphone, and intellectual property alone accounts for about 58%, almost but not quite 2/3 of the value of a smartphone. This is where the action is. And so while it's important to specialize in comparative advantage, it's equally important to think of comparative advantage as a dynamic concept, one that one can achieve over time through investments and through smart policy, so that we break out of the ceiling of 27% and make inroads into the remaining 2/3 of where the value and where the action is. A second way of looking at the transformation that intangibles have done in economic structures is to take a look at the S&P 500. Now, this is the S&P 500 for the US. About 50 years ago, in 1975, 17% of the value of firms listed in the S&P 500 index came from intangibles, and the remaining 83% was very much the traditional bricks and mortar tangibles. That, over time, has transformed to almost the opposite. In fact, more than the opposite. What we find in 2020, which is the last year that we have good numbers for all of this, is that 90% of the value of firms in the S&P 500 comes from intangibles, and only 10% comes from tangibles. The transformation has been not quite as dramatic, but still just as significant if we look at the S&P charts for Europe or for East Asia. And so this seems to be a global phenomenon in which wealth is increasingly held in intangible assets, and less of the wealth is held in tangible assets. A final way that I'd like to present what intangibles mean and how they're evolving is to look at patenting data, in this case for artificial intelligence, which is the current wave of technological change, which is driving a lot of what we do in economics. If we take patents as an indication of prowess in innovation, and they're not perfect, but for now play along, China and the US dominate. This is a two-horse race in which the US and China control something like 93% of the patents in AI. Second, China overtook the US in AI patenting sometime in the last 15 years. Now, this is a good time to digress on how perfect an indicator this might be. Of course, patents are not the only way in which we can indicate innovation capacity, but they're the best one we have. It could be that patenting data in some countries is less good than in others. It could be that some patents are frivolous, some are exaggerated, some are just plain cheating. But even if you factor all of that in and accept that that level of pollution has not changed in the data over time, the trend that we see here is still one worth thinking about. The US and China are playing in a game in which they believe winner takes all. The US and China dominate this game, which explains current geopolitics and geoeconomics in many ways. And then you have a handful of countries, Canada, Germany, France, Korea, who are effectively bouncing along the x-axis and fighting for the remaining 7%. The best in that lot might have 1.5%, the worst might be in the 0.7% range, but any other country other than the US and China that claims to be an AI superpower just has it wrong. Staying on the question of what do the dimensions of intangibles look like, in the US and in the richer part of the EU, investment in intangibles now exceeds investment in tangibles, and the crossover occurred sometime in the late 2000s. If we then look at the three categories of intangibles that we outlined at the start, which is to say software, innovative property, and economic competencies, what we find is that software is the least quantitatively important component of intangibles, while innovative property and economic competencies run more or less neck and neck and dominate. And this is across three broad groups. The US, which you might think of as high income, highly innovative country, the rich part of the EU, and then the Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovenia, and Slovakia, which you might think of as proxies for middle-income countries. And even in those countries, intangibles are spread across the three categories, and software is the least important of the three. Finally, if we overlay intangibles across the Kuznets-Chainery-Sirkin trichotomy that we saw at the start, we find that intangibles are most present in industry and in the services sector, and much less present in the agricultural sector. Next, I'd like to talk a bit about what an intangibles or a digital and data-driven world looks like. What might be its key structural features? And that then leads into the discussion of what that means for policy. The main feature that we see in this kind of economy is high upfront costs and high risk, and as a result, relatively low cost, marginal cost of production once we see success. One way to think about that is to think of the development of software or making music. There's no guarantee whatsoever of success at the start. Someone invests time and effort and money, and that's all the upfront cost. Then it's brought to market, and if the product succeeds, it really doesn't matter whether 10,000 people, 100,000 people, 1 million, 10 million, or more consume the product. It can quite literally be stamped out or sold across the web with very low costs of production. And that's the sense in which I say success is sweet. The profit that you see is almost all of it economic rent, especially once the fixed costs and the startup costs have been recouped. Another way to look at that is to think in terms of natural monopolies or natural oligopolies. When you have high upfront costs and very low marginal costs of production, average costs everywhere falling, which is the classic characteristic of a monopoly. It is possible that we're moving into an era in which more and more firms tend to dominate the market because of this feature. And what goes with it are one or two other things of importance. There's a huge first mover advantage when it comes to these products. If you move in first and then enjoy the benefits of having created a bit of a natural monopoly or oligopoly with one or two other competitors, then in fact it is much more difficult for others to enter that market. And so being first on the market so that you capture the market is an important feature. And that's especially important when we think of standards and standard setting. Standards are the technical handshake that allow products in the digital world to talk to each other. They existed before digital technologies came along. In fact, one of the best examples of standards are actually shipping containers. Once we had one or two standards in shipping containers, the process of shipping across the world and the process of globalization greatly accelerated. Standards make things easy and make it easy to do business. And in the digital world with standards, you actually find for yourself and carve out for yourself the market. Another feature of intangibles is the unparalleled pace of change. Take a look at this chart, which shows us the speed with which breakthroughs in artificial intelligence have occurred in the last 20 years. And what we find is that, for example, handwriting recognition and speech recognition reached the level of human prowess over a period of about 15 years. Image recognition has reached that same level faster in about 5 or 7 years. And in fact, reading comprehension and language understanding have, in the last 2 or 3 years alone, gone from being very poor to beating the way humans would treat the same issue. That kind of pace of change means that policymakers are always playing catch up. It means that users are always having to learn new ways of doing things. And it means that we don't have full control over the technology that might be driving our lives. Another feature of intangible economies are so-called economies of agglomeration. It isn't just that innovation is centered in a few parts of the world. It is actually centered in a few parts of countries in the world. Clusters of innovation on the East Coast and the West Coast in the US, Cambridge, UK, what's called Silicon Wadi in Israel, and parts of India, East Asia, and China as well. There's a combination of talent and research pool, area universities, venture capital, a permissive regulated environment, and a large created market that seems to account for the growth of these kinds of regions. But it's not all about economics. In fact, data especially possesses significant non-commercial dimensions, such as our privacy, our security, and broader questions of human rights, which are part and parcel of the way in which we manage data and AI. And finally, the lines between national and international policy are becoming blurred.